Hello, and may the 4th be with you, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's review for Star Wars Episode 1 of The Phantom Menace. This video is a part of a series of videos where every year on May the 4th, I review a different Star Wars movie. I began in release date order rather than episode order. Therefore, I have already covered the original trilogy, episodes 4, 5, and 6, and so now I am moving on to the prequel trilogy, which is the next movies to come out in release date, starting with Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. So obviously spoilers for a movie that is 24 years old, so I think you probably would have seen it by now, especially if you're watching this review. Now, there are literally thousands of videos on the internet that have reviewed this movie, so I'm going to approach this video from my personal perspective because I'm not going to bring in any more insight and things that wasn't stated like dozens of times before in other videos. However, that being said, I will still bring up some details and facts that you may or may not be aware of about episode 1, but this is mainly going to be just expressing my personal opinion for those who are interested to hear it and my personal experience with this movie. So in that vein, I'm going to start with my personal experience with Star Wars, which is what I've done before in my previous reviews of the original trilogy. And I will say there was a 16-year gap between the release of Return of the Jedi and the release of The Phantom Menace. And the Return of the Jedi, as I talked about before, I was 4 years old when that movie came out, and I have very, very vague memories of that. And most of my memories of when I actually remember seeing the original Star Wars trilogy and when I actually was able to comprehend it was in the early 90s years, so nearly a decade later when I was 12 and I was able to comprehend the movies a bit better. Now, needless to say, I did grow up with it and grow up playing with the toys, but even as a young kid. But again, my memory is very spotty on that. I don't think I truly comprehended the movies until I was 12, 13. And then there was a stage in my life, I think around that time, where I was really, really into Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. The original Star Wars A New Hope, not so much, but I already talked about that when I covered the original trilogy. I was more of a fan, particularly of Empire and Jedi. But I was never that huge, especially there was 1 or 2 years I would watch those movies over and over again. But overall, throughout my teenage years, I was not that huge of a Star Wars fan. I did appreciate the Star Wars films, but I never got into the extended lore, the novels, the video games, the comic books like many of my friends did. In fact, one of my best friends when I was, I think between the ages of 16 and 19, was a huge Star Wars fan, and he was deeply into it. He was obsessed with everything Star Wars, read all the books, had some comic books. I remember I used to play a Star Wars role-playing game with him and a couple of friends, and actually that was the only really role-playing game I've ever played really in my life. I mean, when I was in my 30s, when I went to college, I played D&D with a couple of friends, but I didn't really like that group. I was kind of bored with it, and I remember playing Lord of the Rings, a role-playing game with my ex-wife's nephews and with her sometimes back when I was married, but that wasn't really, we didn't really do it that much. So the role-playing game I really remember playing, at least growing up, was the Star Wars role-playing game. And I remember one time I was a Mandalorian bounty hunter, and I used my jetpack and my torches to torch people. Although I don't think I had that language of Mandalorian back then. I didn't know that. Wouldn't use that specific term until recently, but yeah, that's what I was. And I remember having a huge fun time with that. But yeah, so I liked Star Wars, but I was more of a Star Trek guy. And if you know or are familiar with my channel at all, you would know that because I mostly cover Star Trek on my channel a lot more than I do Star Wars. I was obsessed with Star Trek. And of course, my friend who was really obsessed with Star Wars, we'd often have these, nerdy arguments about who would win in a fight versus Star Trek and Star Wars. He insisted that the Empire could pace the Federation, but I argued that the Empire's weapons were primitive compared to that of Starfleet's, and that Starfleet's shields would not be dented at all against their puny little lasers. And then I remember the biggest argument we got into is who would win, either the Dominion or the Empire, and I think the Changelings would infiltrate the Empire and totally fuck it up. I think I agreed with him that the Empire would defeat the Borg, though, because all Darth Vader could use his, Jedi mind trips to fuck up the Borg. But anyway, that was a huge nerdy shit. So that was my experience with Star Wars. Now, The Phantom Menace, getting into The Phantom Menace, that came out in 1999. So by this time, I was 20 years old, and I didn't really hang out with those friends much anymore. We mostly got stoned, and I was kind of over that. And I had met who would become my future wife, who lived in New Zealand and met her over the internet, and she came over here to America in January of 1999, early 1999, and we met in person, and we lived together for 6 months, and during that time, we saw The Phantom Menace. Now, she wasn't that huge of a Star Wars fan, and I think she may have seen the original trilogy once. And I think it was actually fairly recent as well, but she indulged me, and I remember I was working the day that the tickets went on sale for The Phantom Menace. I wanted to get tickets for the opening show, so I dropped her off to stand in line, and she felt really out of place with all these Star Wars fans asking her all these Star Wars questions which she had no answers to. And I was dumb because I thought the first showing was on a Friday, but it was actually on a Wednesday, and I had to work that Wednesday, and so she stood in line to get tickets for it wasn't even the first showing, so we could have actually gotten it at any time. But that was fine. It was still an experience, and she went and watched The Phantom Menace with me, and then in July, she went back to New Zealand because of her visa could only let her stay in 6 months. So I went to New Zealand for 6 months, in which we got married in December. But when I went to New Zealand in July, we wanted to go out to a movie practically every week for something to do. And hey, we went and saw The Phantom Menace a second time, and it was weird because it was winter in July, and this is the first time, of course, I've ever I left the East Coast of America once. I went to a trip to Arizona a couple of years prior to that, and I think I went to Ontario, Canada when I was 3 years old. But this is really the first time, especially traveling to the other side of the world, that I really, and living there for 6 months, not just, a week trip to Arizona. This was really a huge shift in my life, a culture shock. And I remember one of the things we did was went and saw The Phantom Menace. And I was still getting used to how weird it was that there was in the middle of winter in July. But anyway, and she saw it with me. She liked to indulge me in my sci-fi nerdiness, and you better believe I got her to watch all the Star Trek as well, which she was okay with at the time. But see, that's my memories of The Phantom Menace, and the reason why I bring this up, it does seem seem to be a bit self-indulgent or maybe diverging from actually reviewing the movie, but I think it's relevant information because what I have found by studying the different reception and people's different reactions to the Phantom Menace is that it does highly depend on one's personal experience. Because, as many know, the reaction from, let's say, Gen X, which I think I'm technically a part of Gen X, but I'm actually at the cusp between Gen X and millennials. And it says that Gen X hates the prequels and millennials love the prequels, so it's weird for me as being sort of not really a part of either generation. I'm kind of at the cusp of both of them. And so, yes, it's infamous that the reception from Gen X and older of the prequels is that they're terrible, that they ruined their childhoods, that they were a massive disappointment, whereas the majority of millennials, or at least later millennials, grew up with the prequel trilogy and thus think of them a lot more highly and have a much higher opinion of them. And so that's why I think it's relevant to bring up my experience because I wasn't a young kid when the Phantom Menace came out. And it's funny because my ex-wife had some nephews who were kids when the Phantom Menace came out. I remember one of them having a Phantom Menace t-shirt. And so it was a different experience for them. I haven't talked to them recently, though. I would be curious to see if they actually loved them more than the original trilogy. But so I was 20 years old. But I think that perspective is different from those who are, say, in their late 20s or their 30s, who are sort of more sort of set in their ways, and plus who were bigger Star Wars fans. As I said, I was a casual Star Wars fan. Definitely watched the trilogy at least 100 times. So I don't know. It probably makes me more than a casual fan, but I didn't watch any of the cartoons, Clone Wars, until like just last year, and I didn't read any of the novels or anything. So I wasn't like a diehard Star Wars fan. Still not, but my reaction to seeing the Phantom Menace is I did something that one of my favorite YouTube critics out there, Chris Stuckman, refers to as Phantom Menacing, which obviously he named after this movie because it describes the reaction of people who first saw this movie and loved it and thought it was the best thing ever, and then as years passed, they realized actually this movie is not good. it actually kind of sucks. And then as more years pass, they realize that it really sucks. Now, I watched something recently that did note that there was a lot of negative reactions to the Phantom Menace when it first came out. I watched some interesting interviews from some fans that called it the biggest disappointment ever. But I would say that those were overshadowed by those who liked it. That the majority of fans were happy with it at first, and then as the years passed, started to turn on it. And in fact, I would say the majority of fans turned on it before Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, came out, and I believe that had a even lower reception, initial positive reception than Phantom Menace did, because by the time that came out, that's when most of the fans were sour to it. And again, this I could be wrong. I'm not in the minds of millions of fans, but this was just my impression. So as I mentioned, I saw Phantom Menace the second time, and the second time I saw it is when it's when I really started to realize maybe this movie isn't that good. And I can point to this specific scene in which I realized that, and that is the pod racing. Now, I think it's now time to mention those younger generations, because what was kind of a wake-up call to me was when I went to film school in 2013 in New Zealand. And I was in my 30s, but most of the people at the school were younger, 18, 19, 20. There was a few other people my age, so I wasn't alone, but the majority were like 18, 19, 20. And I remember talking to this one 18-year-old about, because it was just announced that Disney was doing a sequel trilogy, and he was saying that oh yeah, I don't think it's going to be any good. It's going to totally suck because George Lucas isn't involved. And I'm like, well, maybe it's a good thing George Lucas isn't involved. And he said, oh yeah, he's only the creator of Star Wars. And I was like, yeah, and he also did the prequel trilogy. And this guy responded by saying, oh, the prequels are actually better than the original trilogy. Anyone who doesn't think so is just a stupid hipster. And wow, I was like, whoa, that statement really took me aback. And in fact, I mentioned this in a prior YouTube video I did a few years ago, and I've gotten several comments agreeing, yeah, that's true. It is the hipsters that like the original trilogy better. But that's actually not true. It's not hipsters, it's older generations. I think it's more accurate to say. And I think the fact that he was of that younger generation was why he had that perspective, because he grew up with the prequel trilogies. I did not. I was, as I stated, already 20 years old when it came out. And and I even told him, I was like, look, I do agree, and I even made this video on my new YouTube channel, which some people disagreed with, where I thought that the original trilogy was overrated and the prequel trilogy was not as bad as people were saying, and that the difference between the two trilogies isn't as black and white as many people make it out to be. Although I did explicitly state in that video that the original trilogy was most certainly better than the prequel trilogy, and I will get into some of those reasons why later. So anyone, I think I would say, I don't want to use the word objective, but I would say that those who like the prequel trilogy better than the original trilogy are most likely just biased by their generational bias. And that is anyone who studies story structure and script writing can see that the original trilogy is actually structured and created better. But that being said, as I said, I still feel like the prequel trilogy at the time had been getting a lot more hate than it deserved, and that the original trilogy would be getting more love than it deserved, and maybe wasn't actually as good as everyone remembered. And as I mentioned, the other reviews I did for the original trilogy and this is an opinion I truly strongly believe, and which is why I'm not a huge Star Wars fan, is that I think there's only one truly great Star Wars movie, and that's Empire Strikes Back. I think all the other movies are, at best, pretty good. At worst, not so good at all. They're bad to mediocre to fairly good, but there's only one really great. Because I mentioned that the original Star Wars movie I actually think was just average because it's too much like a Flash Gordon cereal for my taste, and the Return of the Jedi had a lot of logical flaws to it, but it was so good. But so my opinion of the Phantom Menace, now getting to the heart of the issue, is that for the longest time I considered this the worst movie in the Star Wars saga. Now, with the release of The Rise of Skywalker, I am not sure. It is either the worst or the second worst. I need to watch The Rise of Skywalker again, and maybe a couple more times, because I actually only saw that movie once. Hard to believe because I didn't really want to watch it more than once. But so I can't really say whether I like it worse than Phantom Menace or not. So that's up in the air, and I guess I'll get to that when I eventually get to the Rise of Skywalker, and I'll make that determination of whether or not I think it's worse than the Phantom Menace. But if you exclude that, I think it is easily the worst film in the Star Wars saga. Now, a common argument I would get in with tons of people, because there's a sizable people. In fact, I would think the groups are pretty much almost even, of those who think Attack of the Clones is worse and those who think the Phantom Menace is worse. Now, I am very firmly in the camp of the Phantom Menace is worse. And yeah, and there's several reasons for that. So, as I mentioned before, the pod racing. It's funny because I remember getting to arguments with people who thought the Attack of the Clones was worse. And one of the main reasons they gave to the Phantom Menace being better, or two reasons they state most commonly, is the pod racing was cool and Darth Maul was cool. And which is ironic because I would state the pod racing specifically for being why it's worse. I hated the pod racing. And again, I'm thinking the particular people who made this argument were younger than me. So maybe they were kids when they saw it and they thought it was cool. Or maybe they just liked the racing aspect. As I said, that was the first thing that made me realize that the Phantom Menace was not as good as I thought it was how boring, how long, how dumb the pod racing was. Because, yeah, I realized later, because I've criticized a lot of other shows that do like racing episodes, like Star Trek Voyager, Stargate SG-1. I think the Bad Batch one was actually fairly decent. But whenever they do like racing episodes, I just don't like racing storylines. I think they're really dumb, and I think this one in the Phantom Menace dragged on for way too long and actually grinded the plot of this movie to a grinding halt, and I was just waiting for this fucking thing to be over and done with, and so we could get on with the rest of the goddamn story. And so I easily point out pod racing as the reason why it's worse than Attack of the Clones rather than why it's better. Now, to address the other one people state, Darth Maul, I think Darth Maul's overrated. I mean, he was highly overrated by many. Seem to have praised them and say, oh, well, the Phantom Menace can't suck because of Darth Maul. He is basically just a secondary henchman, like Odd Job, or was it the one Number One from Austin Powers? Who does Number One work for? I'm trying to think of better examples, but Captain Phasma. But that brings up all these other the people I don't think realized that she was just a henchman, which is why they were upset she wasn't featured more. She's just a nameless henchman. She wasn't meant to be featured more. And I think, like, the Phantom Menace, the title of the film, I had assumed was referring to Darth Maul, and I think a lot of people did, but it's actually not. And the more I think about it, the more I think it's actually referring to Darth Sidious. Darth Maul is just a he doesn't have any dialogue, really. He speaks like 2 lines or something throughout the time. Maybe he's given no character whatsoever. He looks cool. His fighting style is cool. The fight scenes with him are cool. But that's it. Like, that does not make him a good character. In fact, I think a lot of people nowadays who point to Darth Maul as a great character do so because of his inclusion in the Clone Wars and the Rebels show. Now, having recently watched those shows, I love Darth Maul too, as depicted in those shows, because they did make him awesome. They did give him a good character. They did make him a really great villain to watch. But if you go back and watch simply his appearance in this film and how he depicts, is actually, in fact, if you compare it to the Clone Wars and Rebels, he's a massive disappointment. He is nowhere near as good as he is in those shows. And so I think they just picked on people, they picked up on people's like attraction to the fact of how he looks cool and how he fights cool. But in this film itself, which if you're judging this film, you can only judge what's in this film and not, material that came out on a TV show years later. He is a nothing character. He is not very interesting, so he's definitely not a reason why I would think that Phantom Menace is better than Attack of the Clones. Now, one of the reasons why people give to why Attack of the Clones is worse than the Phantom Menace is the cheesy, creepy romance storyline between Anakin and Padme, and the terrible dialogue associated with said storyline. And believe me, I agree. I don't think that is the best storyline ever, which is why I'm not a huge fan of Attack of the Clones either. But honestly, give me creepy, dumb dialogue, badly written romance over Jar Jar Binks any fucking day of the week. Not just Jar Jar Binks, but also childish, silly Anakin. I'm sorry. As much as I don't like that cheesy romance, and believe you me, I will cover that when I cover Attack of the Clones, I think pod racing, Jar Jar Binks, silly Anakin, long, boring Senate scenes, all those totally outweigh dumb romance for me personally. And again, it's this thing of personal taste. All of this is obviously, but it's kind of, I would akin it to, all the people who like Coke over Pepsi, or chocolate or vanilla, or Star Trek or Star Wars, or, those common coffee or tea, whatever. It's like, or Alien or Aliens. By the way, the real answer is Aliens. Sorry, sidetrack. But anyway, it's like those, personal taste side quests, which you like, well, it's all up to the individual. But for me, I think Attack of the Clones is nowhere near as bad as Phantom Menace because of those main things I said. And plus, I think Attack of the Clones has more positives, like seeing the big battle at the end with all the Jedi, actually seeing Anakin come on his own, even with that terrible dialogue and terrible romance, it was still cool seeing the team up between Obi-Wan and Anakin. And so, yeah, for me, Phantom Menace is easily worse than Attack of the Clones. And as I stated, before Rise of Skywalker came along, it was easily the worst film of the Star Wars saga, which I still may believe. Again, that's to be determined. So here's my next point about the Phantom Menace. There was this popular watching order of the Star Wars saga called Machete Order. I think they said it was stated from 2011, from a website, for a blog called the Machete, so it was named after that blog. I think I first heard of it in around 2000. God, when was it? 2014? 2000? Yeah, it was before the release of Force Awakens. But so it was around that time, and I decided to watch it in that order. But it didn't really have the same desired effect on me because I've seen these movies so many times. It doesn't really matter what order I watch it in. But it's more of a recommended order for those watching it for the first time. Now, if you never heard of Machete Order, it's it's a way of watching the Star Wars film, and this was before the sequel trilogy came out, although nowadays they're saying you could just tack the sequel trilogy to the end of it and it will make this, same thing. But Machete Order, because people were debating, should I watch episodes 1, 2, and 3, and then 4, 5, and 6, or should I watch the original trilogy first, and then watch the prequel trilogy? So Machete Order is a different way of, it gives you a third option, which is to watch first Star Wars Episode 4, New Hope, second Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, third Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones, fourth Star Wars Episode 3, The Revenge of the Sith, and then fifth Star Wars Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. So the thinking behind this is that Star Wars Episode 4, New Hope, which is the first Star Wars movie ever made, of course, and some people, it was just called Star Wars when it came out, was that's the best introduction into the Star Wars universe, which I agree, because I feel like if you watch Star Wars Episode 1 first, like, too much of it assumes you are already familiar with this world, assumes you are familiar with these characters, assumes you will get the reference, that you'll cheer when you see R2-D2, that you'll know what's going to happen with Anakin Skywalker. And so I feel like that's probably correct. That is why when I'm doing my May the 4th reviews, I started with Star Wars Episode 4, New Hope, instead of starting with Episode 1. Because I do think that is the best introduction, and so that makes sense. And then you go into Empire Strikes Back next, but then you go all the way back to Attack of the Clones, and then Revenge of the Sith before finishing with Return of the Jedi. The thinking is after the big reveal of Empire Strikes Back, where you find out that Darth Vader is Luke's father, you then get like the flashbacks. You go back to see what they were like when they were younger, and how Darth Vader portrayed the Jedi and Obi-Wan Kenobi, and then you get the conclusion where Luke Skywalker saves Anakin Skywalker and defeats the Empire, which I think is good in theory, but of course, when I did watch it in this order, it was jarring to go from 70s and 80s technology to CGI 2000s and then back to 80s puppets. But story-wise, I think it does make sense. But if you would notice, there was a particular movie that was not mentioned in Machete Order, which is why I bring it up, and that is Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. They are suggesting that you skip over it entirely because it is not necessary to understanding the greater saga. And I just read this article that was critiquing and argued with that. It says, I disagree. I think you definitely need this backstory with young Anakin becoming, and Qui-Gon Jinn and Darth Maul. But I actually agree with the Machete Order. I disagreed with that disagreement. I think they're wrong. And that is why I bring it up, because that is my next major knock against the Phantom Menace, and why I considered it the worst Star Wars film. Because it is completely and utterly unnecessary. I think you could definitely, and actually I would recommend skipping over it entirely. I think you lose nothing, and I think you actually gain not having this boring, childish, silly crap to block your enjoyment of the saga. So I agreed with Machete Order, and as much as I don't like Attack of the Clones, I think it is necessary. I think you need it. I think it's absolutely positively necessary, and it does set things up. Whereas Phantom Menace, absolutely, you could skip right over it and get the same feeling. And this is getting to the main difference between the prequels and the original trilogy, and it harkens back to why I stated in that other video why the original trilogy was better. I don't want to use the word objectively, but really it is better than the prequel trilogy. And the main reason is because each film in the original trilogy, it stands alone. You could watch A New Hope and without, watching anything else Star Wars, and end it and still feel like you're having complete saga. Now, people might argue with me, but I would absolutely say the same thing about The Empire Strikes Back. Yes, it ends on the cliffhanger. Yes, it supposes that you are already somewhat familiar with these characters, but the movie itself has a very definitive, and this is why I've had this argument with people, because there's some modern trilogies where the second part ends like in the middle of the story, like the Hunger Games did this, the Matrix did this, fucking The Hobbit was the worst example in my opinion. The second film, like, almost practically ended mid-sentence. Like, they end in a way that doesn't feel complete. And whenever I bring that up, people are like, oh, Empire Strikes Back. No. I argue to the death with those people. Empire Strikes Back, even though it ends on a cliffhanger, it is a definitive beginning, middle, and end. It is a self-contained movie, and I will fight this to my death that Empire Strikes Back definitely has a definitive beginning, middle, and end. Despite the fact that it has a cliffhanger, it still feels like a complete movie, and you still feel like you have a complete enjoyment. Sure, you want to see the next film to find out what happens to Han first and Carbonite, and further get more information on Darth Vader being Luke Skywalker's father. Sure, you want that information, but it's not necessary for enjoying this film and for understanding this film, which is different from those other, modern trilogies I mentioned, where the Matrix, for example, feels completely incomplete, and that you need to know the rest of it, or part 2 does, what I'm saying, in order to understand the film, especially that the fucking Hobbit. Oh god, they ended in the middle of the thing. But anyway, they might as well end it in mid-sentence. Oh, I know what to do with Smaug. Here's how we defeat them. Boom! Credits. They might as well have done that. But anyway, where Empire Strikes Back absolutely, positively, 100% did not do that, and feels like a complete film. Same with Return of the Jedi. I mean, sure, if you've seen those two films, you have more of an investment of the characters. You're more familiar with them. You understand why they're going to Jabba's hut to rescue Han or whatever. But it still has a very definitive beginning, middle, and end, and is a self-contained film. Now, how this sets it apart from the prequel trilogy is, I feel, even though you could argue the Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones each also had their own beginning, middle, and end, I'm not arguing that. What I am saying is that the Phantom Menace and the Attack of the Clones narratively just serve to set up Revenge of the Sith. In some ways, I could even say Machete Order, you could skip over the Attack of the Clones and just do Revenge of the Sith, although you'd understand it better with Attack of the Clones. But really, that's the only important film in the Star Wars saga, and I think that is definitively of what sets apart the original trilogy from the prequel trilogy. Is the original trilogy is 3 strong stories that make up a whole, whereas the prequel trilogy is 2 setups to 1 strong story at the end. And I think Phantom Menace is even more, as I just mentioned, of an unnecessary setup. Sure, it gives you more backstory. You understand things more. It has the Qui-Gon Jinn, the meeting of Anakin as a child, and starts the Palpatine putting the chess pieces into place. But you could skip it and still understand the movies and still appreciate them, in my opinion, perhaps better without having to sit through this. And that is the main difference between the original trilogy and the prequels, in my opinion. So, Jar Binks. Some people like to compare, I know Lucas himself liked to compare him to the Ewoks, And whenever people complained, some of Jar Jar's defenders would be like, "Oh, that's just the grown adults not getting that Star Wars is for kids, and they're complaining about just because they're not the target audience. They don't understand that the target audience appreciates this comic relief." And in fact, I just watched this interview with George Lucas just now where he explicitly stated that he's like, they don't get that Star Wars is for 12-year-olds, and they want it to be all serious and dire. Like, I can't remember. Oh, like the Terminator. That's what he says. He wants it to be completely serious and dire, like the Terminator, and they don't want any lightheartedness in the Star Wars. And so they groan and complain when we feature someone who's supposed to be a bit of comedic relief, which is all not true. That what he just said was a complete and utter straw man. It's completely not true. Now, I'll address Star Wars is for 12-year-olds in a bit. I'll get to that. But let me focus more on the part of Star Wars fans don't want comic relief, and they want it to be serious like the Terminator. That is objectively not true. And I will use the term objectively very strongly here in this case. That is objectively not true. People appreciated the humor in Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. There was more humor. Let's forget about the Ewoks. So I will bring them up. Believe you me, I'll get to the Ewoks. But even leaving the Ewoks aside, like the jabs, the kind of banter that Han Solo and Luke had in Return of the Jedi, where he's like, Han's like, "How we doing, kid?" And he's like, "Same as always." He's like, "That bad, huh?" And more examples later on, like when Leia brings out the blaster when she's going to shoot the stormtrooper, and Han says, "I love you," and she says, "I know," which is a nice callback to the first one. And stuff like that is lighthearted humor, and people loved it. I don't know of any Star Wars fan who thought, "Oh, those ruined Return of the Jedi." So he is objectively incorrect when he says people wanted to be serious like the Terminator, and that's why they don't like Jar Jar. Now, the Ewoks. A lot of people, not just George Lucas, compared. Well, they always complain about the kid-like characters like the Ewoks, and so that's why they're complaining here. And again, I think that statement is is factually incorrect. That there is a difference between the Ewoks and the Gungans and Jar Jar. Not just Jar Jar, but the entire Gungans I have a huge fucking issue with. And my issue with the Gungans and Jar Jar is way worse than my issue with the Ewoks. Now, I believe I did talk about the Ewoks in Return of the Jedi and how they are definitely a negative on that film for me. But it's certainly, like, I still love it, Return of the Jedi. I still think, and when I said that Return of the Jedi had issues, they're more than just the Ewoks. I have more issues with Return, and if you see my review for that, you would know what I'm referring to, than simply Ewoks. So I'm not saying that the Ewoks are the only negative with Return of the Jedi, and I still love that film. I still, as I said, it's not a truly great film. The only one is Empire. But I still really like that film despite the Ewoks. Whereas Jar Jar and the Gungans make it impossible for me to like the Phantom Menace. I think they are a billion times worse than the Ewoks. The Ewoks, yes, they're an obvious ploy to sell toys. And that's a whole nother thing we can get into, and how the Star Wars trilogy, the original and prequels, made more money off of the toys than the movies itself, which a lot of people, including a producer who's heavily involved with A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back, dropped out of Star Wars, and one of the reasons he gave was because it became more about selling toys than telling stories. So that's a whole other argument one could have. But despite the fact that Ewoks were just a ploy to sell toys and they were childish and silly, they still worked. And as I was watching, like, They kind of interfered, and I think the movie would be better without them, but they still had a part to play in the story. Some of the humor with them was like too childish and silly, such as when the Ewok is swinging the rock and hits himself in the head. But then other parts of it actually do work, like when the Ewok going up to Leia and giving, eating the food, or when their C-3PO is telling them not to cook the other people alive, whatever. I mean, I would rather them not do those things, but I don't think those things actively make the movie terrible by having them there. I mean, they might be better without them, but it's still kind of humorous, and I can still get into it. But more to the point, they had a role to play in the Battle of Endor and defeating the Empire, and I think it made sense. I think it worked. Some people compared it to, other less technologically advanced forces defeating a technologically advanced superior force, such as Afghanistan defeating the Soviet Union and whatnot, and how there's a lot of precedent to that. And that they had a role to play, and like when one of the Ewoks died, got attacked by the Empire and died, I was emotionally affected. I thought it was sad. It brought me to tears, and as much as I think maybe the movie would be better off without them, and it was just to sell toys, it didn't make the movie terrible. That is contrasted with Jar Jar and the Gungeons. Jar Jar, the humor is just... Okay, so there's a lot of... Let me try to explain this. There's a lot of child humor that is geared towards children that adults can enjoy. I think the prime example of that is the Pixar films. Pixar films are unarguably geared towards children and a younger generation. But many adults love Pixar films, and many adults can enjoy Pixar films. Like, I was brought to tears, particularly in the movie Inside Out. And Finding Nemo, I think, is one of the funniest movies I've ever seen. And mind you, I saw these films as an adult. I never watched it as a kid. I was already a fully grown adult for both those movies, and I still love them. So compare that to Despicable Me, or The Minions, more likely. Actually, more specifically, the Minion movie. The humor in a lot of DreamWorks movies, but more specifically the Minions, the humor in that is so childish, so dumb, majority of adult fans do not like them. It is geared specifically for kids, and you really have to be a young kid to really enjoy that and to really get into that. And the humor is just too childish and too ridiculous. That is the difference between Ewoks and Jar Jar and Gungeons. Ewoks is Pixar. Jar Jar and Gungeons are the Minions. The humor is childish, ridiculous. You have to be a kid in order to enjoy it. And even so, like, I've heard, like, I watched the videos where people are arguing kids love Jar Jar. I don't think that's necessarily true. And in fact, I would say the majority from my knowledge of the reception I had from the younger generation of the prequels, maybe they didn't mind Jar Jar as much as older audiences did because they grew up with him, but they still don't love him. Like, for the majority of younger fans who were kids when the prequels came out, still don't think Jar Jar is like the best thing or one of the best things about the prequel. They still don't really acknowledge that he is not a good character, and is widely accepted, I would say, in the Star Wars fandom in present day, that Jar Jar is a terrible character. And on a lot of these theories, like the Sith Jar Jar, or Jar Jar the Sith, is kind of ironic and meant to make it better. And I remember when I saw The Force Awakens, or it might have been The Last Jedi, one of those I saw at a big premiere midnight showing at this big, huge theater in Wellington. And there was all this cosplay and everything. And I remember there was these teenagers who came with these really cheap homemade Jar Jar costumes, and a lot of people were like, "Yo, you're brave. That's awesome for being brave." Because it's I think Jar Jar is less hated now than he was, but he's still I think it's generally acknowledged that he's not a good character, and a lot of people do stuff like that, like the cosplay and the Jar Jar Sith. It's kind of ironic. It's kind of like poking fun, having fun with the fact that he's such a terrible character. I think it's acknowledged that he is a terrible character. And the tone of having Jar Jar in all the Gungeons, like at the scene where Padme, and it was supposed to be a very pivotal scene where Padme was begging for the Gungeons to help free the Naboo people, had this guy going, "Me's like this." The tonal inconsistency with there's this big serious battle where a bunch of people are going to die, and let's go ask for this opposing army that we're usually not friendly with to help, which is a very, plot driven, like, serious point. And you contrast that with the ridiculous childness of "Me's like this." The tonal inconsistencies just do not compute. They do not work. In other words, it actively interferes with what the story is trying to do. It is too out of place. The Ewoks, as silly as they are not that out of place to actively interfere with the plot in the way that the Gungeons and Jar Jar does. Particularly, I was thinking contrasting the battle in the Phantom Menace where the Gungeons are fighting the droid army to the Ewoks fighting the Empire in Return of the Jedi, because there's a huge contrast. There's a huge difference. As I said, I buy the Ewoks fighting the Empire. I think it fits into the story nicely, even though I still believe it would be better off without them. It still works. Whereas the Gungeons, it doesn't work. I don't buy the Jar Jar, like, dropping all the weapons and accidentally shooting the stormtroopers, and clumsy and dropping all the bombs that just so happened to blow up the things, and the general, and him being promoted to a general. This ridiculous, beyond cartoonish, dumb character being promoted to a general is beyond the threshold of suspension of disbelief. And so it actively sabotages what the plot of this film is trying to do, which is something that the Ewoks absolutely do not do. And so it makes the film a bad film. It makes it unwatchable. Like, there's no way I could consider this a good film from the Jar Jar and the Gungeons alone. They actively effectively ruin the film. And that is all there is to it. Now, to address George Lucas's, again, objectively false, inaccurate claims that Star Wars is for 12-year-olds, I think all that one needs to do is look at the negative backlash to Jar Jar and the Gungeons to prove that that statement is incorrect. And I think George Lucas has something he didn't understand, is that Star Wars went beyond just being a kid's film, especially when the majority of people who grew up with Star Wars and loved Star Wars and had it so near and dear to their heart were no longer children. And he was false to not try to appeal to them as well. And as I said, there's easily a way you can appeal to both audiences, such as Pixar, such as Harry Potter, such as Lord of the Rings. There's an easy way to appeal to both audiences, and he did not effectively do that. You can't do that by having characters as childish and as juvenile and too geared towards too much like Minions and less like Pixar characters. You cannot appeal to both audiences at the same time that way. And that's his failure. His failure to realize that no, Star Wars is not just for 12 years old. Star Wars, the original, and this is something like Empire Strikes Back. You watch that. That is not a movie for 12-year-olds. 12-year-olds can enjoy it, sure, but adults can enjoy it just as much, if not more. Now, Return of the Jedi, you could argue, is more for kids because of the Ewoks, but even that is still easily enjoyable by adults, whereas Jar Jar and Gungeons are not. So he is factually incorrect in that case, and I do wonder if he's changed his stance since then. And this brings us to the bigger argument of the art versus the artist. Because many people argue, because when George Lucas was being so upset about the reception of The Phantom Menace and Attack of the Clones, many fans argued that this is not just your film. Once you release this property, the original trilogy, into the public space, it also belongs to the fans, and the fans have just as right to point out any disappointment they express by you not trying to appease them. Now, this brings up a whole other debate, long discussion of, and this is a topic I'm actually really interested in, of the spectrum of trying to appease the fans and trying to tell a good story. Because I think it is a spectrum. I think people who paint it as a dichotomy as either or you make a film for the fans or you try to make a good story, I think that's an incorrect way to state it. I think it's a spectrum. And it's more complex than just a dichotomy. But again, that is a topic, as Mas Kanata would say, for another time. That is way too deep for me to get into this video, which I am guessing is already going to be very super long. But there was a tiny plot point I wanted to bring up before I forgot, and that is the fact that Padme is posing as a handmaiden and reveals herself to be the queen towards the end of the film. This plot point seemed really unnecessary, and I think it adds any. It doesn't like take away necessarily from the plot, but it doesn't add anything. And so when watching it, I'm thinking, why did they do this? Like, this seems completely just unnecessary. Like, there's no reason to do this. And I think it does hurt the plot a little bit, because then you're realizing this queen who's making all these decisions, who's going to the Senate and calling for a vote of no confidence, is actually not the queen. She's just a decoy. Like, that doesn't make any sense. So yeah, no, it does actually take away from the plot. It's completely unnecessary. And so this gets into the larger issue about George Lucas. Many people accuse who don't like the prequels, and particularly this film, say that's because George Lucas had free reign and no one really challenged him. In fact, that producer, and I can't believe I forgot his name, I should have written it down, but the producer I mentioned before, who was involved with A New Hope and Empire Strikes Back but dropped out because he thought toys were becoming more important than storytelling, he is quoted as saying that he feels like the reason why Phantom Menace and the prequels were not good was because no one challenged George Lucas. No one was there to challenge him, which is in contrast to even Return of the Jedi. where he did have people who were willing to challenge. In fact, when I covered Empire Strikes Back, I talked about how him and the director clashed on many occasions. Him and the writer clashed on many occasions, and they were able to come up with a compromise and agreement. Now, I am not saying that the director and writer in that case was always right and George Lucas was always wrong. I'm sure if I were to look at the specific cases on a case-by-case basis, I would side with George Lucas sometimes. But that's not my point. My point is it was more of a collaboration. He had more people to challenge him, to test his theories, and because George Lucas, by his own admission, is not a great writer, nor is he a great director. And this gets back to my larger argument I had with that 18-year-old back in 2013, was that him saying that George Lucas needed to be involved. George Lucas was, I look at him kind of similar to the way I would equate Gene Roddenberry to Star Trek. He is the creator. Without him, this great epic franchise saga would not exist. And he deserves all the credit in the world for that. He deserves all the accolades. He go as far to call him a creative genius for creating the Star Wars universe. But when it comes down to the very specific details of writing, creating, and directing a film, he is not what I would call an auteur, like Peter Jackson or James Cameron. But even Peter Jackson had collaborators. Whereas Lucas apparently, and by all accounts during the filming of the prequels, did not have collaborators, and that no one was brave enough to challenge him. And so I would definitely attribute that a lot for why the prequels didn't work and why the original trilogy was better. And more specifically, George Lucas did not direct Empire Strikes Back or The Return of the Jedi, which I do believe are, as I stated, the two best of the original trilogy, Empire being the best of the entire franchise. And I do think that is a huge mistake that George Lucas decided to write and direct all three prequels, and part of the reason why it didn't work. And I do think these films would have been better had they had the insight of another director. And again, that is not to say that George Lucas sucks and is always wrong, but I think having that back, that other perspective, that someone to bounce things off of, would only have improved the film. Now, it is said that George Lucas originally asked Ron Howard, Steven Spielberg, and Robert Zemeckis to direct The Phantom Menace, all who turned him down, saying that they believed that this was George's baby and that he should have directed it, which I would disagree with them. But at the very least, if they were not going to direct the first one, they should have directed the second or third. Maybe they could let George do the first one, but then take over in the second and third. But even then, as I said, this first one was a disaster, so I think one of them should have directed. But it's obvious that George Lucas kind of wanted to direct it himself anyway, because, and he stated this, he said that even though he did ask those people, that he kind of always knew that he would end up directing it. So I think those other directors probably could sense that George kind of wanted to direct this himself, which is why they suggested he do. Again, that's just my wild speculation, but that's the sense that I get. So because if he really wanted someone else to direct it, he could have gone to a lesser-known director who I'm sure would have jumped all over. And that's not to say a lesser-known director would not be any good, because a lesser-known director directed Empire and Return, and they were both great movies. So It absolutely could have been great, even with the lesser-known director. You don't have to get a big name like Steven Spielberg or Robert Zemeckis or Ron Howard in order to make it a great film. But yeah, so, and I think that is a major downfall, and that he really didn't understand. Now, Anakin Skywalker's a young kid. That's another annoyance of the film, along with the Gungeons. Not as bad, mind you, but that is another major reason why I think this is one of the worst Star Wars films. First of all, you don't need this storyline. We don't need to start with Anakin as a young kid, and I thought that was a weird decision when I heard they were going to. I honestly feel like the prequel trilogy should have been started with Attack of the Clones and had a movie taking place during the Clone Wars as part 2, and then ended with Revenge of the Sith. I think we would have had a better prequel trilogy. And this gets back to what I was saying before about this segment is completely unnecessary. But because we don't need to see Anakin as a young kid, we really don't. And I hate to say this, knowing what happened with the behind-the-scenes drama with this actor, but this actor's not any good. And apparently that's one of the things people said behind George Lucas's back, but were too afraid to say to his face, was they disagreed with the casting of this particular actor and didn't think it worked. Moreover, and I would say it's beyond just the acting. It's the script writing as well. That's pod racing! And how he gets in the ship and has this little kid running in a ship in the big, dog fight, and manages to sneak in the battleship and destroy it. This, again, stretches suspension of disbelief to a breaking point where I can no longer suspend disbelief. And so that is another major flaw with the film that I just can't look past. But I do think it's necessary to state, since I had called out particularly Jar Jar and young Anakin as being two really low points of the film, that the real life backlash that these actors received, where they received death threats to the point where it caused depression, to the point where the actor who played young Anakin had to be institutionalized, and the actor who played Jar Jar was suicidal at one point, that there's no excuse for that. That is completely and utterly disgusting, and it makes me absolutely disgusted that fans could be that vile. I mean, I know people write shit on the internet, and especially this is when the internet was in its infancy, and people more got used to that kind of vile being commonplace on the internet nowadays. But the fact, and so they would probably write it anonymously, but it still disgusts me to no end. And I did really appreciate it, and it was really heartwarming when they featured the actor who played Jar Jar in a role as a Jedi in The Mandalorian recently as an act of redemption. That brought a behind-the-scenes, heartwarming, really feeling of redemption that I know a lot of fans picked up on. Because I know this toxicity came from a very small minority, but it's still completely and utterly inexcusable, and I want to make that very clear, because I still hate Jar Jar, and I still hate the performance of young Anakin. I hate their inclusion, and I hate everything about it. I think it ruins this movie. But if anything, actually no, there's no one should receive death threats over that. It's just a fucking movie. It is absolutely disgusting, and they shouldn't even be. They're just actors. If you want to blame someone, blame George Lucas, but again, don't send him death threats because it's just a fucking movie. It is absolutely, and I don't care if it's anomalous of the internet or just a joke and they didn't really mean it. It is absolutely disgusting to the extreme. And I do think it is necessary for me to point that out. Anyway, I need to consult my notes because I know there was something else I wanted to bring up before I left. Metachlorians. So, this was a huge controversy, the deal with metachlorians, and because they were first mentioned in this film. I wasn't as hateful, and some people just like cannot stand the whole concept of metachlorians and go into an absolute rage whenever they're brought up, which is why in this modern era of Star Wars they're hardly ever, if ever, mentioned. Like they're almost completely forgotten because of this massive negative backlash to metachlorians. I didn't really care. Like, it's just, especially when I first saw this movie, it didn't jump out at me, and it never bothered me to that degree. I will say that when I heard, and this is something I'll probably cover more when I cover Force Awakens eventually, that George Lucas's original idea for the sequel trilogy involved something called the Wills, which played off of metachlorians. It was like, and basically implying that these Jedi and Force users had actually no free will and were being controlled by these beings called the Wills. And that idea, I think, that is disgusting. That idea is absolutely terrible. And so when I hear some people who hate the sequel trilogy say George Lucas should have done it, I'm like, look at his ideas. They would have been, as whatever you think of the sequel trilogies, however much you don't like them, they clearly would have been way worse, and I am very thankful that George Lucas didn't do them. But maybe, I'm just hearing the rough idea of the Wills. Maybe if I actually saw the Wills in action, I would change my mind, but I seriously doubt it. Now, that is another thing, the last thing I want to bring up, because I know I've already been going for over an hour, is that the prequels seem to be looked on more positively now. In fact, I've watched YouTube channels where they often say, like, at one point people didn't like the prequels. I'm like, what do you mean at one point? It seems like there's a lot of people who still don't like the prequels, but again, they're probably from the older generation. There's a lot more younger generations now that do appreciate the prequels, apparently. And now, especially after the sequel trilogy came out, all the hatred and vile that was directed as the prequels have now been redirected at the sequel trilogy. But I will say this. There was a 16-year gap between Return of the Jedi and the Phantom Menace. And there was like a 10 or 11 year, I think it was a 10-year gap between Revenge of the Sith and Force Awakens. So they're both large gaps where mostly, we had the Clone Wars, but, and then of course there was like the Ewok special, but that's bullshit. But so those large gaps were mostly devoid of Star Wars, where Star Wars fans wanted more and were waiting for more. And so when those two movies came out, they had a similar effect of people being, these films being so highly anticipated and people wanting so badly to see them, and that's why they made like huge amounts of money, and people were just like so anticipating them. Now, I bring this up because I just saw an interview with George Lucas where he said that, in fact, not just George Lucas, there are a few other people involved with this film, saying that the anticipation for this film was so high, there's no possible way it could deliver. And George Lucas does specifically point to the backlash on the Phantom Menace being because of the expectations being unrealistic. But I would disagree with that statement, and I would point specifically to the Force Awakens as an example of why that statement was incorrect. And it has more to do with the quality of film itself. Now, Force Awakens, I have a lot of issues. Believe you me, I have a lot of issues with The Force Awakens, which I'll get to when I get to it. I do think The Rise of Skywalker is the clear worst film of the sequel trilogy, but I think The Force Awakens set up the sequel trilogy for failure, and is why the sequel trilogy failed was specifically because of The Force Awakens, which I blame the most for the failure of the trilogy, even though I do acknowledge Rise of Skywalker was the worst film in that trilogy. So I'm not saying it's a great film, but there's no arguing that The Force Awakens was much more well received than The Phantom Menace upon its release. The reception and review was mostly positive over The Force Awakens, and so that is what proves George Lucas wrong in saying that there's no way The Phantom Menace could have been received positively. Force Awakens disproves that, because in both cases there was a large gap. In both cases people were highly anticipating and wanting a new Star Wars. It just so happens that The Force Awakens delivered in what they wanted, and The Phantom Menace didn't. Now, there are complexities to that argument, because one of the reasons why The Force Awakens delivered is because it just recreated the first film and played to fan service. But which is why, but I would say, despite that's not the reason why it was received more and better, and the main reason, could it be part of it, to be fair, but the main reason is because it's a better film. It has better characters, it has a storyline that makes more sense, and as I said, I don't love The Force Awakens. I have a lot of issues with it, but it is easily a better film than The Phantom Menace. And that has a hell of a lot more to do with how these films were received upon release. Not the anticipation, not people being unrealistic. The simple fact that The Phantom Menace was not a good movie. And it was not the good quality. And Lucas and other people who love the film were just in denial about that. And that is my conclusion on The Phantom Menace. One thing that I did want to talk about, I kind of forgot to talk about, is the political aspect of this film. How it's basically, and that's, I think, the main function of the film, is setting up for Palpatine's takeover of the Senate. At least all the scenes that deal with the Republic and the Senate. And it's interesting because I just watched this really interesting video essay that examined the portrayal of the fall of the Senate and the takeover of Palpatine in the prequel trilogy, and how it's actually brilliant. And I actually agree with that, but as far as Revenge of the Sith goes, because I still love that movie. And it's funny because I was just watching my review for Return of the Jedi I did last year, where I specifically said I thought Return of the Jedi was the second best film of the Star Wars saga, and it was better than Revenge of the Sith. But now I'm changing my mind, especially after watching that essay and reasserting what I always said before, that I do believe Revenge of the Sith is the second best film in the Star Wars saga. But of course, we'll get there when I get to Revenge of the Sith. But my point is that although I agreed with this video essay about how brilliant it was, that it portrayed the takeover or the turn from a democracy to a dictatorship, I think the bulk of that happens, and the bulk that I'm impressed with happens in Revenge of the Sith. I still stand by my statements that the Phantom Menace is completely unnecessary. Now, it does add flavor to it, but I look at it more of as an appendice, kind of like the Clone Wars or a novel or something like that. I don't think this needed to be a actual film a part of the trilogy. It just adds some context to it, but it's not completely necessary. But it is interesting to see the betrayal of the Republic in this film, and the end of the Jedi, by the way, which is something in the video, but not something I really hyper-focusedly picked up on, because it's a very subtle, very sort of mature adult theme, and it's in the movie with these silly cartoon characters going again. Yeah, don't get me started on this clash of tone. But anyway, it's a subtle, really interesting theme of how the Republic has decayed, and that the Senate, for example, had gotten really complacent, and the Jedi themselves are all, as I said, they're also very complacent. And I was watching the scene with the Jedi when Qui-Gon takes Anakin to the Jedi Council with sort of fresh eyes, and kind of realizing that Yoda and Mace Windu, who are, I think, now badasses, particularly after watching the Clone Wars series, and all that other weird, guy with the weird shaped head or whatever, and the other people in the council. I always used to think of them as badasses, but I was watching this scene with sort of the perspective that these actually are kind of curmudgeon, complacent, sort of, I wouldn't use the word idiots, but they've kind of grown complacent, and particularly when Qui-Gon introduces the aspect of the Sith, and their initial reaction is to completely reject it. There's no Sith. There haven't been Sith for 1,000 years. Get the hell out of here with that bullshit. And that Qui-Gon was like represented the rest of the last of Jedi who were still like invigorated, who were still fresh, who still cared, and that the council itself kind of decayed to a point where it wasn't really functioning. And it was the same thing with the Senate, how they were very slow to react and get any reaction to the invasion of Naboo. And that's the thing, is that Palpatine kind of did have a point, that the Senate and the democracy and the Jedi Council and everything was failing the Republic. And I think this is also noted and emphasized by the fact that there was still slavery and lawlessness out in the Outer Rim, saying how the Republic and the forms of democracy only gave a shit about the core worlds, the rich worlds, and they neglected the Outer Rim, and because it was a failing body of government that just wasn't working and wasn't serving people, and was controlled by a lot of self-interest, which again is reflective of a lot of modern and historical governments today, which I will not get into a lot of them. No, I'm not just pointing to one, but and yeah, so it was a huge, really, again, mature adult commentary in the movie that supposedly the director says for 12-year-olds. But anyway, let's just stop harping on that point. But God, it just irritates me. But anyway, it is a very, so it's a very complex commentary on how that was the first step in this democracy turning into a dictatorship, into fascism, was the fact that the democracy itself had failed and was failing, and a lot of the government bodies were just bogged down in bureaucracy and weren't being governing effectively, which does remind me of a lot of modern times, because when I get into arguments with people who tend to lean more libertarian, they tend to say, well, the government is ineffectual and they're not effective and they're not active, so we should strip their powers, which I don't understand that argument, because my argument is, if you strip away their powers, then they'll be even more ineffective and inactive. Your goal should be to reform this ineffective, inactive government, get rid of the elements or the interference that is causing them to be ineffective, and make them more effective. I think that actually should be the goal. And I think it's kind of the same thing. It's a very similar argument here, because, of course, Palpatine uses this as uses people's disillusion with this government body, which has in fact decayed. And this is something that's actually explored a lot more in the Clone Wars. Again, it's a cartoon that does an amazing job of setting up this very complex political theme, although the Clone Wars does do a much better job of blending the childlike and adult elements than this film does. But again, which is, this film just clashes. But anyway, so this is something that is explained, that, and is a subtext that is there, that is how Palpatine is able to take over. And again, this is based off of a lot of real life examples where fascism takes over, is because the government body that existed, or the democracy that existed, had become so ineffectual or inactive or corrupt. And I'm thinking about Cuba in that particular case, but there's a lot of examples where the people are disillusioned by it, and so they actually welcome when a fascist dictator takes over, but again, that's addressed more in Revenge of the Sith, which I'll get to. But you see that this film, and I stand by that, it's unnecessary, but it is interesting as an appendice, because you see Palpatine starting to put all the pieces in place. You see how he is, because when you realize that Palpatine is Darth Sidious, that he's playing both sides, and this is what we'll get to more in the Clone Wars, because he's actually both sides of the clone. He's controlling both sides of the war. But here, you see that he is actually a senator from Naboo, and he's also working with the Trade Federation to invade Naboo, and it's obvious that he chose Naboo specifically for the Trade Federation to invade is because he's from Naboo, and the invasion is actually what allows him to become Chancellor. The sympathy vote, as he mentioned specifically, is why he thinks he's going to beat the other candidates for Chancellor. And he also uses the fact that the Senate is ineffective and inactive to coerce well, it wasn't Queen Aladama, it was her bodyguard, but anyway, that whole bullshit doesn't make any sense. But anyway, to coerce the Queen into calling for a vote of no confidence to remove the Chancellor, to allow him to grab power. So this is all, so he's using the fact that the Senate is ineffective and inactive in order to grab power, which again is very strong commentary reflective of a lot of historical situations where fascism has taken over and destroyed democracy. But here's my one complaint, because I remember when I first saw the Phantom Menace, and they mentioned, Senator Palpatine. I was doing, you imagine, that meme of, I think it's from the movie Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, with Leonardo DiCaprio pointing at the TV screen going, That's what I was doing when I first saw this. But here's something you have to understand if you kind of forgot, because you're sort of more used to a modern perspective, or you're a bit younger and may not realize this, but back in 1999, when the only official Star Wars canon that we actually had was the original trilogy. I mean, some of the novels might have been endorsed by Lucas, but still, I wouldn't have said they were official canon. But regardless, the only real official canon that we had was the original Star Wars trilogy, in which they never used the name Palpatine. In fact, the only reason how I knew that the Emperor's name was Palpatine was because of my friend that I mentioned before, who was such a huge Star Wars fan and read all the books, and so he would mention that his name was Sheev Palpatine. I only knew that from him. So what my point is, the majority of people did not know that Palpatine was the Emperor, that the Senator Palpatine, as predicted in this movie, was the same person as Darth Sidious. So this was kind of like an end joke, or like an Easter egg for fans, diehard fans of the Star Wars films would be able to pick up on this, but the casual viewer would not. Which I actually think is a mistake, because that's such a huge aspect of this film, understanding that Palpatine is playing both sides, that he is both the senator from Naboo and Darth Sidious at the same time, so which brings a lot more weight to the scenes with him, like when Darth Sidious tells Viceroy is like, I will control things here in the Senate and make sure no action's done. Because if you don't understand, if you don't know that Darth Sidious and Palpatine's the same person, you don't realize when he says that, he's saying that senator who was promising Queen Amidala, I will do what I can to help this invasion, is actually making sure that there is no help coming, which I think brings a lot more weight. So I do think it's a mistake that that this wasn't made more explicit. And, it is common knowledge now that the Emperor's name is Palpatine, but as I said, back in 99, the layman did not know this. And the only reason I knew this was because I had a friend who was obsessed with Star Wars. So, yeah, I think that was definitely a mistake there. Now, I am giving the film praise for the complex commentary on how fascism takes over, but at the same time, I still, again, this could have been an appendice or a TV show or a book or something. I don't feel like it's that necessary to see the early beginnings of him starting to manipulate things. It becomes more necessary when we get into the Attack of the Clones, and especially Revenge of the Sith. So those movies, I feel, still deserve to be part of the trilogy. But I think we should have, as I said, that Attack of the Clones should have been the first one, and there should have been a second movie taking place during the Clone Wars and having maybe some of the aspects that we saw in the Clone Wars cartoons, but in movie form. And then especially seeing Anakin be like a great Jedi, because that is a major complaint of the prequel trilogy, is that and why the Clone Wars is kind of better than the trilogy, because in A New Hope, Obi-Wan talked about how, tell Luke your father was this great Jedi, but we didn't really see that in the prequel trilogy. We saw it for 30 minutes of the first part of Revenge of the Sith, and that's it. Because in this film, he's just a whiny kid going, now that's pod racing. And in the next film, he's an angsty teenager going, fuck you, Obi-Wan. And he's not a great Jedi. So we only see him as a great Jedi in 30 minutes of one film. So that's why I think Attack of the Clones should have been the first film, and there should have been a second film where we saw an entire film of him being a great Jedi, and we saw more about the political maneuvering, and we could have maybe explained this better the way the Clone Wars cartoon did, the political maneuvering that Palpatine was doing and fleshing out characters like Count Dooku more instead of making him just a generic bad guy, which again the Clone Wars cartoon did. So yeah, so that's what I would have done. I would have restructured this trilogy and gotten rid of the Phantom Menace because it's completely unnecessary, and it could have been a cartoon or a book or something like that, so we could see the early beginnings of Palpatine putting the pieces into place, but it's not needed, and that is my very strong opinion on that. So my rating for Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, out of 10 is a 3, very poor. The positives are not Darth Maul, not the pod racing, but Qui-Gon Jinn. Liam Neeson is definitely the best thing about this film. Ewan McGregor as Obi-Wan Kenobi, not one of the most positives about the entire prequel trilogy. The fight scene, the Jedi lightsaber scene with the epic music. By the way, the epic music is definitely the highlight of this film, particularly that Duel of the Fates, which is, if I didn't babble on for so long about other things, I would have went longer about that in this video about how amazing, the score, of course, is always amazing. And how amazing that particular, and how iconic that particular piece of music has become and attached to the entire Star Wars franchise. So those are what highlight why this film is so great. Or not so great, I should say why it gets a 3 and not a 1. But so those are the positives of the film. The rest of the film, and by the way, this whole argument of Lucas saying that Star Wars is for 12-year-olds, the majority of this film features long, drawn-out scenes of people arguing over trade regulations in the Senate. And this reminds me of this pitch meeting, if you've seen the pitch meeting that Ryan George does for The Phantom Menace, where he talks about how this film is for kids. It's like, oh, my kids love watching C-SPAN. I'm like, stop watching C-SPAN and talking about trade regulations and go play a video game. Yeah, so that's another reason why George Lucas is whole, oh, this is for kids. If it's supposed to be a movie for kids, why do you have hour-long scenes where people are arguing over trade regulations? What? But anyway, that bullshit, Jar Binks bullshit, Gungeon's bullshit, young Anakin bullshit, nonsensical fighting, Padme hiding as a handmaiden for no fucking reason, pod racing that went on for way too long, and got to just stop the film to a giant halt, and otherwise, just the pacing. If you compare this pacing of this film to any film in the original trilogy, it is very poorly paced. It is way too slow. It is way too boring. It does not have the action adventure pace people expect from Star Wars, and it is just very sort of and a lot of the acting, even from the good actors, is very sort of toned down and low key. And it just does not succeed at all in capturing what people love about the Star Wars films. And just, even if you take out the word Star Wars, though, it's just not a good movie. It's just the tonal deaf. The tone deaf of this film. The fact that it has these childish minion-like characters combined with half-hour-long political debates about trade routes, and to go back and forth with, I didn't even address the racial stereotypes of the Trade Federation aliens, and all this other shit. Just makes this a terrible film. And as I said, there is some good stuff which makes me elevate it to a 3 rather than a 1. But I do think it is one of the worst, if not the worst film in the entire Star Wars saga. So that is it for my review, and it's totally unnecessary, as I mentioned. You don't even need to watch it. You can skip right over it and lose nothing. Anyway, that is it for my review of Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Thank you so much for watching, especially if you stuck all the way to the end. I know I babbled on for quite a long time. Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to check out my channel as I cover many other shows, particularly Star Trek, at the moment covering Star Trek the original series. So be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.